Hello everyone, my name is Stewart McPherson. I hope you're all very well and staying safe during the coronavirus situation. I'm creating a few online lockdown lectures to hopefully brighten up your time in lockdown and add a little bit of colour. So I hope you enjoy this. This one now is on the Lost World Mountains of Venezuela, the Tepuis or Tepuis Mountains of Venezuela. So let's go exploring in Venezuela, shall we? Okay. So the Lost Worlds are very famous as these gigantic plateaus in the south of Venezuela. They're also famous for being home to the beautiful carnivorous pitcher plants Heliamphora. So this is what they look like. They're giant plateaus that rise up to 1,000 meters above the surrounding lowlands. And honestly, they are simply the most spectacular places on Earth. There's nowhere else quite comparable to them. They're breathtaking, and ever since I was a little kid, ever since I was a little boy, I always wanted to go and explore them. I was very lucky to do so. So here's a few stories about them. These are typical landscape shots of what they look like. You'll see these are shot from helicopters, and the just scale of them is epic. The truth is, you just can't really appreciate how massive they are from these photos, but you'll just have to take my word for it. They're absolutely incredible parts of the world. My talk today is going to really be about the biogeography, about the story of exploration, and about the wildlife, the landscapes, and some of the amazing spectacles like the Jasper Creek, a waterfall that flows over pure semi-precious blood-red gemstone. Before I do so, though, I want to tell you a little bit about the story about how these amazing plateaus were discovered and found to the Western world. But if you hang in there after the story of discovery, you'll see the plants and the animals as well. I should just explain my background. I kind of found my footing exploring and writing books and documenting wildlife on these plateaus when I was about 20 years old or something like that. I did about 6 years out there, doing many expeditions over 6 years, and explored about 25 of these plateaus. There's about 100 or so of them in total. That was about 10 years ago. I've been back a few times since, but most of my expeditions were like a decade or more ago. Although I've been going back a few times since, but mostly I've been working in Southeast Asia. So most of the trips that you're going to see spoken about, I did a decade ago, and I look a bit younger in these photos. So just wanted to explain that. You also have to forgive me. I wrote a few books on them. One of them about the story of exploration and biogeography called Lost Worlds, and another one on the Heliamphora, the beautiful pitcher plants from there. But this was about 10 years ago, so I've got some notes. I hope you'll forgive me, particularly the dates of some of the explorers. I have to remind myself because it has been a decade or so since I wrote that book about this. So here goes. So the area that we're talking about is called the Guiana Highlands. This is a really spectacular part of the world. It encompasses the 3 Guiana countries, which is Guyana, which previously was the colony of British Guiana, Suriname, which was previously a Dutch colony, and French Guiana, which actually is still part of France. It's an equivalent of an overseas territory of France. So if you look on a European Union, on a Euro bill or a Euro note, you'll actually see French Guiana demarcated in the top corner of that. So incredibly, a part of South America is also part of the European Union and part of Europe through France. The Guiana region also includes the extreme north of Brazil, the extreme east of Colombia, but by far the most important region is the south of Venezuela. And this area in pink is the area really that we're going to be concerned with in this talk. This is the land of the Tepuis, and almost all of them occur inside Venezuela. Okay, yeah, a few do occur on the borderlands of Brazil and Guyana, and there are a few very small ones that are exclusively in Brazil and Guyana. But for the purpose of this lecture, at least, the overwhelming majority are in Venezuela, and certainly the biggest and the most spectacular and the most interesting ecologically and biogeographically are in Venezuela. So the first Westerner that could have sighted the Tepuis Mountains, the Lost World Mountains, was most likely Walter Raleigh. Raleigh undertook a few expeditions in search of the golden city of El Dorado, and his first trip in 1595 he went up the Orinoco River and documented 7 massive plateaus. These are roughly in approximately the area where the eastern tepuis are located today, Roraima, Cuckonan and the eastern chain. It's impossible to know whether Walter Raleigh really did see them. A lot of the things that Walter Raleigh documented were definitely made up. There's no other way to put it. He documented tribes of people with their heads sunken into their chest, and other people with giant feet that they used as umbrellas. So a lot of the things that Walter Raleigh documented were definitely made up, but it doesn't really matter. He was an incredible explorer, and we don't really know whether he reached the Tepuis or not. But certainly it would be an extraordinary coincidence if he documented the plateaus pretty much right where they are. The first explorer that definitely did reach them was the wonderful and great explorer Robert Schomburgk. Schomburgk was a German cartographer that was employed by the British government, that was sent down to what was then the colony of British Guiana to demarcate the border with what is now Venezuela. Venezuela didn't exist at the time, but what became Venezuela. Schomburgk undertook an epic expedition across this pretty much terra incognita. He left in 1831, I believe it was. Let me just check. 1835, and finished this first expedition in 1839, so it took him 4 years. And during that journey, he reached the eastern Tepuis and drew this beautiful illustration here. And there's absolutely no question, this is the eastern Tepuis. This is Roraima on the right, Cuckonan, and Cuckonan has two parts, which is really clearly shown here. Yorani, Guadaca, the little pinnacle here, then the Iliutraman Massif over on the left there. So there's absolutely no question he got there. We also know that because he documented all the plants, the animals, and the tribes there too. He also documented beneath the shadow of the towering cliffs of Roraima. He documented Heliamphora with his brother. They returned on a second expedition in 1841, and Richard Schomburgk was definitely the more of the botanist of the two. And Richard Schomburgk was absolutely overjoyed by his botanical discoveries. They wrote a beautiful book. Richard Schomburgk wrote a beautiful book called Botanical Reminiscences, and in it he documents the Heliamphora in this so-called El Dorado swamp. He was so enamored and in awe of the amazing diversity of new plants, and they found loads and loads of new species of plants, one of which was this Heliamphora. Interestingly, that swamp that Richard Schomburgk discovered has never been relocated. It's never been found, and Heliamphora nutans has never been found again in the lowlands, which is quite interesting. I've actually searched for it a few times myself, but no one's ever found it. Anyway, after Robert and Richard Schomburgk reached the plateaus, the tepuis of Venezuela, they returned, of course, with beautiful accounts. Richard's book, Botanical Reminiscences, was published later, and Robert went on to create a beautiful work called 12 Views into the Interior of British Guiana, one of which was this beautiful painting, which obviously is based on the previous one. It's a gorgeous, stunning shot showing the eastern tepuis. This whipped up excitement and basically encouraged a series of other explorers to go down and explore this very romantic, interesting, exciting area of South America. This is the bit where I'm going to need my notes, I think. I just have to quickly mention, if anyone is interested in colonial literature, you really should read Robert's accounts, and also particularly Richard's accounts as well. They write really poetically underneath these huge cliffs and document just the awe and magnitude and scale of these incredible plateaus. And they also actually interestingly documented some of the beliefs and legends that the native Amerindians, the Pemon tribe, actually had of these mountains. Robert wrote that the Indians believed the summits can never be reached, and on the summits themselves that there were lakes filled with dolphins that were circled by guardian white eagles. Other stories held that among the Pemon, the local tribe, they believed that the tepuis were places of fallen warriors, where fallen warriors would go and commit suicide, that defeated warriors would climb up onto the cliffs and jump off and commit suicide off these huge cliffs. So, of course, they were very, very central to the stories, the beliefs, the spirits of many of the Pemon Amerindians. And that's it clear, not just in the accounts of the Schomburgk brothers, but many, many, many other explorers that went down to this part of the world. Okay, so the next explorers that went down, well, one of the next ones was a German botanist in 1849 called Carl Apun. And he, like the previous Schomburgk brothers, proclaimed the summits inaccessible. There was no way to get up there. You've got to put your mind in the centre of a 19th century explorer. You've got to remember that these cliffs are not small cliffs. I mean, these are hundreds and hundreds of metres tall. The very biggest of the tepuis have cliffs over 1,000 metres tall, such as Aoyan Tepuis, where Angel Falls flows over, which is 979 metres in height. So those cliffs are nearly a kilometre. Carl Apun proclaimed the summit totally inaccessible. Some of the next explorers in 1869 were Charles Barrington Brown and James Sawkins, two wonderful explorers that also reached the base of them. They estimated the cliffs to be 2,000 feet high on Roraima. They got to the foothills but couldn't reach the summit. And James Sawkins illustrated this beautiful illustration. This is actually owned by Sir David Attenborough. And Sir David very, very kindly and generously allowed me to come to his home and borrow this painting to be professionally photographed and used in my Lost Worlds book. So it was very kind of him, and very sincere thanks once again to him for doing that. But as you can see, James Sawkins painted the side of Roraima really clearly. This is the southeastern flank of Roraima, with Kukunan over there in the distance on the left. And you can just see the scale and the magnitude that these cliffs represented. And that illustration was then duplicated in many more books and reproduced here as a lithographic plate. Another explorer went down, Charles Barrington Brown in 1976 suggested that nothing but a balloon could ever be expected to reach the summit of Mount Roraima. The problem, of course, is you could never, ever transport a balloon across on porters. Porters just couldn't carry this all the way down. And besides, it wouldn't work anyway. There were powerful updrafts against the cliffs, and that would smash the balloon. There's no way it would reach the summit like that. So unfortunately, that idea came to absolutely nothing. In 1977, The Spectator magazine, a British magazine/newspaper that still runs to this day, described Mount Roraima as the greatest marvel on the earth. It described it as an island of sandstone, but also proclaimed it forever beyond the reach of mankind. It speculated that there could even be people on the surfaces of the lost worlds on the Tepuis, and this was genuinely believed by Victorian naturalists. It was not known, of course, but they generally speculated that there could be people or ancient civilizations or even lost prehistoric life on the summits of these ancient plateaus. They thought they could have been cut off from the rest of the world and isolated up there. In fact, the Spectator piece even compared it to Japan. Bizarrely, it described how the islands of sandstone towering in the clouds could be like the islands of Japan, and how you have a great civilization on those the Japanese isles. Same could be the case on these lost worlds, separated from the rest of the world. So people really, really were getting excited. An explorer in 1879 reached them, called Michael McTurk, and his colleague John Boddam-Whetam, and they said nothing but a winged Pegasus of mythology could reach the summits of the mountain. So they were slightly negative on this front. McTurk actually offered them one of his guns. Guns to the native Amerindians were more than valuable than gold. They were priceless, and if anything, would have persuaded the Indians to show a way up if they knew one. Boddam-Whetam thought a gun would, but even that didn't. So it was really clear that the Indians didn't know a way up to the summits of the mountains. And in any case, there's no way they could have. They'd have needed metallurgy, metal skills, and they didn't have that. There's no way the native Amerindians got up there either. So the story kind of went on. More and more explorers went down there. Another explorer suggested that the only way to reach the summit would be by building a giant scaffold up the sides of one of these plateaus. But again, you just can't physically make a scaffold 500, 600, 700 meters tall out of wood. It would just break and collapse. So that idea also came to nothing. So just at this point, here's Boddam-Whetam's beautiful illustration, and you can just see the romance in these drawings, in these illustrations. And you can imagine 19th century naturalists becoming more and more excited about these exotic, romantic islands in the sky, because these plateaus have been called islands in the sky for a long time, and that's precisely what they are in many ways, with these beautiful waterfalls flowing off of them. So the romance grew and grew and grew, but still they were beyond the reach of mankind. Just after they'd been heralded the greatest marvel on earth in that Spectator magazine piece, basically all hope had been abandoned. By this point, 50, 60 years of explorers had been going down there with really high hopes of reaching the summit, but just basically returning empty-handed. But just when all hope had been abandoned, and it was thought that these mountains would forever be beyond the reach of mankind, just at that point, an explorer called Henry Whiteley, who actually only went down there to try and find a species of bird that had been discovered a few years earlier, Whiteley went down there without any particular hopes of reaching the summit. He was just looking for his bird, but happened to spot on the southern flank of Roraima this ledge, this towering ledge up the cliff sides. You can see it here. And this is one of the illustrations that accompanied his account. He documented this spectacular ledge on the slopes of Roraima and thought that it could be a staircase up to the top of the lost world. So Whiteley made an all-out effort to try and cut a trail through the cloud forest that covers the base of Roraima. He tried really, really hard, but unfortunately didn't get the direction of his path quite right, and he hit the base of these giant cliffs of Roraima, but very, very unfortunately, it wasn't the right location, and he didn't hit the base of the ramp, of the ledge that goes up Roraima. So unfortunately, failed to reach the ledge and had to return. He had no supplies left and just had to return empty-handed. There was just nothing more he could do, and I just had to return, unfortunately, which was a great, 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 great shame. But, very sportingly, he published an account of the ledge that he had spotted in the Proceedings of the Royal Geographical Society, Britain's equivalent of the National Geographic. He very kindly did that to try and encourage other people to give it a shot and see if they could get up there. And guess what? It worked. Joseph Hooker, who had been interested in these mountains for a long time, Hooker was one of Darwin's closest friends and a great naturalist in his own right. Hooker immediately realised the significance of this ledge and wrote to a naturalist called Everard Im Thurn, who at the time was the curator of the Natural History Museum in Georgetown in British Guyana, the country next door to Venezuela, or what was Venezuela. Venezuela didn't exist at the time, but anyway, very close to Roraima, and persuaded Everard Im Thurn to set out on a new journey to try and reach the summit of Mount Roraima via the ledge that Whiteley had discovered. So this is what they did. Everard Im Thurn set out and spent 4 weeks with his colleague Perkins, and they had a pretty epic journey on the canoes up the rivers all the way through the jungles of what is now Guyana, and reached the borderlands on which Roraima sits. After 4 weeks of difficult canoe life and journeying, they finally broke through the vegetation and spotted Roraima out there on the distant horizon, and got closer and closer and closer. I have to say, Roraima is one of the greatest mountains to climb in the world. I've climbed hundreds and hundreds of mountains, and honestly and truly, this is one of the most spectacular in the world. And the thing I love about it is, as you get closer, it just looks like a small plateau on the horizon, but you absolutely can't gauge the scale of this thing. And as you get closer and closer and closer, it gets bigger and bigger and looms above you. And that's precisely what Everard Im Thurn documented. This is one of Everard Im Thurn's original photographs from his expedition, taken in, if I remember correctly, I think it was 1881. I might be, yeah, no, I think it was 1884. It was in 1884 he made this journey. He got closer and closer and closer to the giant cliffs, and he correctly made his trail right up in the right path all the way towards the bottom of the ledge, so succeeded where Whiteley had failed. He reached the ledge, and as he started to climb up, there was a waterfall, which Whiteley had actually documented, and Everard Im Thurn was quite worried for a while that the waterfall had eaten into the ledge and made it impassable. But luckily there was a route past the waterfall, and if you go there today, it's pretty easy. You can just walk through it. It's quite a bit of a shower, but it's still, you can get past it, up the slippery rocks. And as I say, it is one of the most incredible treks in the world. As you climb up through this ramp, you go through different vegetation zones, and you actually walk through the clouds, and then finally emerge and see these spectacular, towering clouds out across in your in your view, and it's magical. It is the most incredible mountain in the world. As Everard Im Thurn approached the top of the ledge, you get to the exact spot that he stepped into, and he wrote in his account how one footstep more would took his eyes to the level of the plateau surface to behold a land never before beheld or seen by mankind. And when you climb Roraima, you take that step, and you finally reach the summit. And lo and behold, it wasn't a land of dinosaurs or lost civilizations or the lakes of dolphin-like creatures as the native Pemon had speculated. It was actually, perhaps even weirder, a landscape which Everard Im Thurn described as some strange country of nightmares. A land of twisted stone carved by the water and the wind. Really, really weird rock formations covered with crystals on the ground, and bizarre plants and bizarre animals too. You've got to remember, this wasn't like a normal colonial era expedition when a few new species of plants and animals would be discovered along the course. For example, like going to the Amazon. It wasn't like that at all. Here, it was like stepping onto another planet. Pretty much every single thing they saw was new to science, like going to another planet. It was very, very, very exciting. Everard Im Thurn and Perkins actually only had food for a few. They'd pretty much run out of food. They had only a few days left, and unfortunately, they spent less than a day up on the summit of Roraima. But it was enough to have conquered the plateau, and to bring back many new species and many new accounts for science. But they'd opened the doorway to the lost world, and others would then follow. A little side note is that Everard Im Thurn's journey. Everard Im Thurn's journey was in 1884, and in 1912, Arthur Conan Doyle, the author that wrote the Sherlock Holmes books, wrote a really wonderful book called The Lost World, which follows a fictional journey about discovering a plateau in the jungles of South America. Of course, Conan Doyle's story is fictional. It's great work, but it is a made-up story. But every single element of the fictional story of the journey to the plateau is definitely based on the real story of discovery of Roraima. For example, Arthur Conan Doyle's plateau is on the borders of 3 countries, just like Roraima is on the border of Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil today. The vegetation zones, as you go up, as the explorers in Conan Doyle's story, they go up the mountainside, relate almost exactly to the vegetation zones that were documented widely on the ascent of Roraima. And interestingly, on the southeast corner of Roraima, there's a giant pinnacle, a big blade of stone, which is pretty spectacular actually, which that many of the explorers documented. It's called the Tawashin Pinnacle. And Arthur Conan Doyle, the explorers in Arthur Conan Doyle's story documented how they reached the summit of their mountain by climbing up a pinnacle, getting all the way to the top, then cutting down a tree and making a bridge. And so I think it's very likely that it was based on the Tawashin Pinnacle as well. Well, obviously today we have slightly different ways of reaching the summits of these plateaus. There's about 10 that you can either climb up or walk up. The others are still only accessible by helicopter. interestingly, many of them, most of them I'd actually say, were only accessible with the advent of helicopters in the area, when helicopters were brought down there in the 70s, 80s and onwards. So many of them have a very short story of exploration. Okay, well, while we do have an easier job today in exploring them than those early colonial era expeditions, there are still some challenges. Getting fuel logistics around, getting some of the very few planes in the area. This is one of the few planes that is down there. It's an old Soviet Union Antonov plane. If my memory serves me correctly, this one was built in 1985, and it really is something out of a history book. You'll notice it's a biplane with 2 wings, and inside it's just literally a hollow shell. There's no seats, there's nothing. You just sit in it. So if it crashed, I mean, you'd be ripped to pieces. But anyway, it's really good for transporting drums of fuel and cargo around. It's an amazing plane. So that's a shot of it there. I love that plane. There's one helicopter owned by Raul Helicopteros, which is very well maintained and a great way for exploring the Tepuis. And you can get around. These are older helicopters as well, from a different place. Let's say there are different challenges. On my last expedition, like I said at the start of this talk, most of the trips that I did to these lost worlds was about 10 years ago. But I've been back a few times recently, and my last time was about 2 or 3 years ago in 2017. And very unfortunately, Venezuela was going through hyperinflation. And so that caused a very big problem that the colonial explorers didn't have. They could pay their Amerindian guides with salt or beads and different, or certainly guns, though they would certainly work for guns and things like that. Today, though, for money, it was a bit difficult. All of this money that you can see here was worth, I think, $100 or $200. It was virtually valueless. And we actually had to charter a Cessna, a small plane, to carry suitcases and suitcases of money just to pay the porters a few bucks, literally a few $100 for their help for a few days. So just the transport of the money was a difficult challenge. And you can see here just the sheer quantity of notes that you needed to pay very small amounts. So of course we all got our photos pretending to be drug lords like this. And I think each block of here was like $1 or $2. So you can just get a picture of how difficult it was just paying out small amounts of money. And this was 3 years ago, and I think unfortunately it's exponentially worse since then. So I'm not sure what is being used these days. Yeah. Okay, so now moving on to the biogeography of the lost worlds. So how they formed. So as South America split away from what was at the time Gondwana, basically remains what became Africa. Gondwana comprised other continents too, but as South America split away from Africa, the African landmass, as it was driven westward about 70 million years ago, the Andes formed. Classic GCSE geography, oceanic plate going underneath a continental plate, crumpling and uplifting, causing volcanoes which form the Andes. But as that happened, a massive upward current of pressure pushed up the north of the continent into a shield of rock about 30 million years ago. This gigantic shield was called the Guyana Shield, a giant plateau basically, and that covered most of this area in yellow, certainly this area in red. More or less, it was an even surface of rock, uplifted up to 3,000 meters above sea level, just pushed up as the continent went westward. This, over the last 30 or so million years, has been eroded and denuded, mainly by water action. Rivers have eaten into the weak points in the shield of rock and just cut down and eroded back. So today, the shield has retreated. The shield has eroded down into smaller fragments. And the Tepuis Mountains today are the last fragments of that ancient shield of rock. So it's just like sand on a beach. If you have an even surface of soft sand, throw on a load of pebbles, then if it rains really heavily, the sand will be washed away from all areas except the bits of sand underneath the pebbles. So you'll end up with pebbles on little towers of sand. Not because they've risen, but because all of the rest of the sand has been washed away. And that is precisely the case for these tepuis. So they are not, this is very important, they were not uplifted individually. The exact opposite, in fact. They represent the last remnants of an once even surface of land. They're the last little bits of that surface. And so that's what they are, which is very important to understand. Okay, so they're scattered across this area, the Guiana Highlands. There's about 100 of them. The word tepui actually comes from the local Pemon word tepuis, or something like that. I don't think the pronunciation is quite right, but basically tepuis, something like that, which means sprouting rock, because that's precisely what they are. They sprout out of the ground and dominate the horizon. There's about 100 or so of these plateaus scattered across the Guiana Highlands, differing in size from less than a kilometre to many, many, many kilometres in size. And some of them are vast. The word is spelled tepui with an I, or in some cases tepui with a U. But the very important thing about these plateaus is that they're not like conventional mountains. Normal mountains are basically triangular in cross-section, going up to a point, whereas the tepuis are not. They're rectangular in cross-section, with flat surfaces and more or less vertical sides. The cliffs, though, and this is, you can't get the scale of them from these photos. You just have to trust me on those. Just to give you an indication of this, by the way, the green stuff here on the sides of this photo, that can be bushes and trees. These are massive, and the very biggest of them can have cliffs up to 1,000 meters tall. That's how massive they are. 1,000 meters, a kilometer. For our American friends, that's over 3,000 feet. That is huge. Some of them aren't that tall, but others of them are. So the plateau tops stand between 2,000 and 3,000 meters because the surrounding areas are generally around 1,000 to 2,000 meters in altitude. They're isolated on all sides by these cliffs, which is very important for their ecology. So they're often called the islands in the sky or islands in time because of their isolation. Here's some shots of them. And again, you cannot get the massive scale of these things. They are so spectacular and so dramatic and so huge. They're ecologically very, very, very special for two main reasons. Okay, of course, the cliffs. The cliffs are huge. There are many other groups of plateaus around the world, from plateaus in West Africa to plateaus of the Badlands in the United States of America. But the Lost Worlds, the tepuis, are just on a different level. They're bigger than any other plateaus, as far as I'm aware, on Earth. They're incomparable to anything else. The sheer size of the cliffs makes a physical barrier. It is true that some animals can actually pass across that barrier, like hummingbirds are definitely known to be able to fly up to the top and down to the bottom again. But for most animals, a sheer kilometre of vertical height, particularly for terrestrial animals, is a barrier they will never cross. It's just simply too big. So they're isolated on the tops, or on the lowlands out of the tops as well. But probably more significantly than all of that is the fact that ecologically, the summits of the mountains are completely different in terms of their ecological conditions to the surrounding areas, the lowlands. I use the term lowlands somewhat cautiously because the surrounding areas can actually be 2,000 meters above altitude. So obviously that's not lowlands at all, but it's relative. So the lowland surrounding areas beneath the towering plateau surfaces. Yeah, the lowland areas are generally hot, steamy jungle or consist of hot, dry savanna. But in contrast, the summits are very, very different. They're cold, they're extremely wet, extremely rainy, and completely different habitats. It would literally be like comparing the highlands of Scotland with the tropical lowlands of Brazil. And so for animals and plants, that barrier is greater than the physical barrier of the cliffs. In many cases, I think that's true. For example, it would be literally like taking an anaconda from tropical jungles and tropical swamplands like Los Llanos and chucking it on the top of a mountain in Scotland. There's no way it would survive. And precisely the same is true here. the ecological differences between the hot rainforest or dry savanna down in the bottom, contrasted with the cold highlands of these plateaus, is absolutely immense. And these animals the animals, even if they can exchange between the two ecosystems, they generally won't survive. So for that reason, the summits are very, very isolated. You often get clear ecological strata. From the lowlands, it's savanna or rainforest down at the bottom, in this case savanna here with the light green. Then very, very dense tangled cloud forest, which is very difficult to machete a trail through. It's tangled, it's extremely dense wood, it's very, very hard to get through. And then the summits themselves is the so-called pan-Tepuis biome, the summit biome, the summit habitat on the top there. It's also quite interesting to note that there's definitely been no ice here in the recent past. So, as I'm sure as you know, there's been not just one ice age, but many, many, many ice ages over the last 1.8 million years or so, and possibly longer. Something like 40 glacial cycles are well documented. That's a cold glacial, an interglacial, then a cold glacial, then an interglacial, again and again and again. During each glacial period, the ice expands over the world or accumulates in different places, and then generally retreats in the interglacials. Even though these mountains are very close to the equator, that doesn't necessarily preclude them from having ice. There are still equatorial glaciers today. For example, on Mount Kilimanjaro or on Puncak Jaya, for example, on the island of New Guinea. But we know that there hasn't been ice on the Lost Worlds for a long, long time because the rock is sandstone, it's porous. So if there had been ice, the water that would have been inevitably gets into the rock, expands, and that would cause freeze thaw. It would shatter the rocks, and that hasn't happened. So they've definitely not had ice, and they've been stable for a very, very long time, as is very clearly evident from the spectacular rock formations that you see all over the summits of these mountains. So you can argue the extent to which the summits have been isolated, and this is a bit of a debate with ecologists and biologists, but I think no one would question that the fact that they have been isolated to some extent for up to 70 million years. It's not quite as simple as them being the lost worlds of Conan Doyle's story full of dinosaurs. They have had influences from the rest of the world. But it is also true to say that they are home to many ancient living fossil, so-called basal species, archaic species. Again, I don't want to oversimplify this. I don't want to try and portray them as lost worlds of dinosaurs, because they're not. But it is definitely true to say that there are lots more archaic species than you find elsewhere in the world. And that is undoubtedly because they've been isolated for so many millions of years through time. Secondly, really amazingly, these plateaus, these spectacular plateaus, are like islands above the clouds, or islands in the sky. They are the terrestrial equivalent of the Galapagos Islands. They're the closest you can get to islands on land. And this is very evident exploring them. For example, when you helicopter down chains of these plateaus, you notice species diversification precisely the same as the Galapagos Islands. Island biogeography operates here exactly as it does on oceanic islands. That means that there's pockets of habitat that's locally isolated from each other. So what you get is similar wildlife on each plateau, but it's different. So you have the same genera of animals and plants occurring on them, but generally you'll have unique species on each individual plateau, or at least each group of plateaus. And that is very, very, very clear and very, very, very prominent. Interestingly, up to 70% of all the animals and plants that are found on the surfaces of the plateaus occur only in that summit environment, the so-called pan-Tepuis biome, and nowhere else, not in the lowlands. And up to 35% of the animal and plant species of each individual mountain occur there and only there, and nowhere else in the whole world. So those rates of endemism, those rates of unique species, are incredibly high, just off the chart. This is shown very, very clearly with the Heliamphora, these pitcher plants that I love and I've been studying. These show this the island biogeographic processes very, very clearly. Each tepui, or each group of tepuis, generally has its own species of Heliamphora, and each Heliamphora species is found only on that particular plateau or that group of plateaus and on none of the other ones. Exactly like the Galapagos finches, exactly like the Galapagos tortoises, etc., etc., etc. So this is very clear with the Heliamphora and its specification exactly like on islands, on ocean islands. So you get each plateau having a different species. Some of them, for example, evolved to live in really harsh, barren environments, like this is Heliamphora minor, that produces really small carnivorous leaves that grows amongst rocks on Tepui, which is a really, really rough, rocky, wild plateau. Whereas other ones, this is Heliamphora nibline, grows amongst vegetation, so produces much bigger pitchers because it's more sheltered and has to compete with a lot of other vegetation and plants around it. So this gives rise to an exceptionally rich diversity of species. Okay, obviously, you know, the north of South America, tropical South America, is very rich anyway. For example, the Amazon basin. But the fact that you've got tepuis on rainforest and savanna, as well as all of the different habitats that are going up, and then the summits as well, makes this ultra species rich. This area is exceptionally biodiverse, which is very special. Now, I mentioned some of the ancient species that live up here, and again, I really am not trying to oversimplify this, but some people call these plateaus islands in time. There was a wonderful book in German, Inseln in der Zeit, Islands in Time, or lost arks, because they harbour many of these so-called living fossil or archaic species. And again, without trying to exaggerate that, this is true. You get lots of species that are closely related to species that have died out or are known only from fossils. And one such example being Oriferinella, this toad down here in the left-hand corner. Apparently, it's more closely related to toads in Africa than anything else in South America. And that's clearly because the ancestors of these Oriferinella toads have ridden on top of the plateaus after they split away from Africa, and all of their close relatives either didn't get to the lowlands of South America or died out there, and they've survived only on the surfaces of these beautiful plateaus. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's about roughly 10 that you can climb, main big plateaus. All of the others accessible only by helicopter. It's not true to say that you can go to a tepui that no one has ever stepped foot on. They've all at least had someone step foot on them. But you definitely can go to ones that have been very little explored, or at least areas of them are virtually unexplored, and that no one really has really surveyed or looked at what species they occur. Not only that, on the surfaces of some of them, you can only land in certain areas, which makes even larger areas of the plateaus virtually unexplored as well, because you physically can't land a helicopter in many of them. You have to organise the helicopters very, very, very carefully and bring around drums of fuel to make the journeys possible. And the helicopters can only land in certain areas on them. The summit landscape is very dramatic and very, very, very harsh. This is a typical landscape. This is actually on Tepui, one of the most extreme of all of the tepuis. It's a landscape of stone, of barren, naked stone for the most part. Often with labyrinths of towering stone pinnacles. These labyrinths are incredible. Some of these rock formations are 10, 15 meters tall, and they've been carved by the wind and the water. I don't actually completely know why the rocks have been carved like this. I don't think it's as simple as that they're ventifacts, that they're carved by the wind. I personally think it's something to do more with carbonic acid in the water, dissolved in the water, dissolving them. But I don't really fully understand and know the reason for these extraordinary shapes and formations. Many of the labyrinths are very dangerous, and this is not an exaggeration to say that many people have lost their lives in them. It's very, very easy to get lost in them, even with GPS, because the labyrinths are not only confusing mazes, but they're crisscrossed with ravines So it's very, very difficult to explore and find your way through. And some of them have these spectacular rock formations and carved rock formations as well. They're very interesting. Believe it or not, the surfaces of particularly the eastern tepuis are mostly barren. They're actually very, very, very empty landscapes. But it's the fact that where the vegetation occurs, those areas are very rich with species and very diverse. And there's many factors that explain these tendencies. The Tepuis summits are among the wettest places on Earth. Each Tepuis is a bit different, but it can be something like 2,000 to 4,000 millimeters of rain a year. Incredibly wet places. Rain hammers down most days, particularly in the months of June, July, August, and so forth. It can be extremely wet. Very, very wet places. And this has a very profound impact on the ecosystems. All of the nutrients and all of the sediment gets scoured from the summits by the abundance of rain and washed over in rivers that cascade in some of the tallest waterfalls on Earth, including the tallest waterfall on Earth, Angel Falls. So the impact that this has is that the nutrients are exported, continuously exported from the surface of the mountain and forever lost. So as a result, the ecosystem of the summits of the mountains is crippled. There's a lack of nutrients and a lack of sediment. It becomes a so-called rain desert, where it's the abundance of water that cripples the ecosystem and prevents an abundance of biomass from accumulating. That's why there aren't real soils on these plateau summits, just peat that accumulates and then gets systematically scoured away and destroyed, and the whole cycle starts again. As a result, many of the plants have to grow on bare rock, such as Brocchinia tatii, this bromeliad here, beautiful bromeliad. But yeah, it has to grow on bare rock, specifically for this reason. And many of the plants are very, very well adapted to growing on bare rock and have lots of adaptations. This Brocchinia tatii, for example, is a bromeliad, and it can accumulate organic material within its leaf rosette and water within its leaf rosette. So it's really adapted to growing on cracks or even on bare rock. So it's an ultimate survivor. Because there's no one species that proclaims dominance, so it's not like a forest where, a few species of trees would dominate and push out all of the other species. Because no one particular species is dominant, you get very diverse communities of plants growing together. So very beautiful habitats as well. So, for example, if you look at this one photo, you've got aquatic habitats, terrestrial habitats, epiphytic habitats, lithophytic habitats on rocks, etc., etc., etc. So it's very, very, very diverse, very rich in habitats, which allows some very amazing plants to exist and evolve. This one, I have to say, is one of the most incredible that I've ever seen in my whole life. This plant is called Stegolepis hitchcockii, and I took these photos on Neblina. And as far as I know, these are the only photos ever taken of this plant. It's an iridescent-leaved plant, so its leaves sparkle and shine electric blue. So to be clear, this is not a pigment, this isn't a colour of the leaf, it's an optical effect, like a CD. When you move a CD around and it shines rainbow colours, well, that's exactly the case with this iridescent-leaved Stegolepis hitchcockii. But bizarrely, they only have the iridescence on one side of the leaf. And I don't still know if there's an explanation for this. This is another such iridescent-leaved plant. This is a fern called Elaphoglossum wadakii. And it has these magnificent blue leaves. They sparkle and shine like this. Absolutely gorgeous, almost like peacock feathers. Again, only from certain angles, just like an optical effect. You have to move your head around to see them properly. This is what this particular species grows out under rocks. And no one, I think, really understands why they have these leaves. It's kind of a paradox, because the fern grows in shade, so it's clearly not for protecting against UV light, because it's not in harmful highland UV light, it's in caves. The entrance to caves are under rocks. It's also not to attract pollinators, because ferns don't flower. They reproduce by spores. But also, why would the Stegolepis then have blue shiny leaves? Because they're also only on one side of the leaf, so it's presumably not a UV protective mechanism, because why would they have it only on one surface of the leaf then? So I think still to this day, no one really knows. There's also huge numbers of carnivorous plants. There, as far as I'm aware, this is the greatest concentration of carnivorous plants in the world. Places like Western Australia probably have a greater number of species, but in terms of the sheer abundance of carnivorous plants as a whole, I think the Guiana Highlands is the greatest concentration in the world. They have sticky sundews that catch their bugs by sticky leaves. They have lots of different species of pitcher plants that have beautiful, highly evolved leaves that trap bugs when they fall in. They have utricularia that produce little bladders with low pressures inside that suck in victims and digest them. And interestingly, several of the species here grow as epiphytes inside tank bromeliads. This one here is Utricularia humboldtii that does that. And there's also a few others. There's Genlycia, a really unusual species, or genus I should say, with corkscrew traps underground. And there are also two other genera of bromeliads that contain carnivorous species that catch bugs a bit like pitcher plants. There's a few interesting paradoxes here. Many of the plants produce exquisite flowers, even though they live in really harsh, hostile places. And that's ironically or paradoxically because they have to attract the few pollinators that exist. So you often have incredible flowers in the most inhospitable, barren and hostile places. And so that's kind of you often see that. These exquisite orchid blooms in very, very harsh conditions. You also get some amphibians, some frogs and toads, and you get some pretty amazing birds. This is the oil bird that lives in this ravine here. And it's called the oil bird because it was traditionally used for the fatty reserves on its body that was used for oils by settlers of South America. But also it's very unusual because it makes clicks. It's one of the very few birds to have a form of echolocation, a bit like bats. So it can click and kind of determine distance in the dark. It's pretty amazing to see. Here's a shot of him. There are some ancient invertebrates like these tractor millipedes, these plated millipedes. And interestingly, whenever an animal dies here, immediately after it dies, a flurry of plants explode around it and grow to form a so-called death garden. And you can see here a bird has died, and the release of nutrients into this very, very, very nutrient-starved ecosystem, explodes with explosion of life. So you can see that here. There have been a few animals that are believed to be recent introductions. Up that ledge of Roraima that we spoke about at the start, well, before the crisis in Venezuela, the economic crisis of the last few years, thousands of tourists climbed up Roraima every single year. And many of them unfortunately left a lot of litter, a lot of rubbish as they went up. And these coatis followed the tourists and supposedly followed all the rubbish all the way up to the top of the plateau and unfortunately reached the surface, and they're still there to this day. I've actually myself found potato plants, carrot plants, lots of introduced grasses that are growing around many of the camping areas on the summits of the plateaus as a result of, unfortunately, that have been spread there by tourists. I now just really quickly want to show you some of the amazing landscapes and features of the Lost Worlds. So particularly Roraima and the eastern Tepuis are home to a lot of quartz crystals. This is because as the Guiana Shield was pushed up, dikes of magma solidified within the rocks as dikes and sills and cooled very slowly, forming beautiful quartz crystals that have been eroded today. And these are very numerous all over the ground on the surface, particularly of the eastern Tepuis and especially Roraima. And when you walk across the surface of Roraima, you'll find great drifts of quartz. All of this white stuff here is quartz crystals. This is the Valley of the Crystals on Roraima. So all of that white is just pure quartz crystals. Down in the lowlands, there's a gorgeous waterfall called the Jasper Creek, where the falls flows over blood red gemstone. You can see this here. This rock, this blood red rock, is a semi-precious gemstone called jasper. And interestingly, at certain hours of the day, it looks different. If you go there when it's really overcast without much sun, it's kind of brown and not that particularly that attractive. But if you go there when the sun is really shining on it, particularly around 11 o'clock, yeah, it looks like this. It's beautiful. Really, really, really beautiful. So it can look like this, and very, very, very attractive. Semi-opaque, that's why it shines. And you can just imagine the value of this massive block of semi-precious jasper. Very special place. Of course, the Lost Worlds are also home to the tallest waterfalls on Earth. And I deliberately use the word in the plural there. Because, okay, obviously the most famous is Angel Falls, which is 979 meters tall, nearly a vertical kilometer. But there are actually countless other falls on many of the other tepuis that are not far off the same height, 700, 800, something like that meters tall. Anyway, Angel Falls is the tallest of them all, and it's so big that when water flows off the side of it, it can take up to, I think, about 30 seconds for the plumes of water to fall all the way down the sides of the giant mountain and the giant cascades. So you can see how spectacular, how beautiful the falls are. Angel Falls is actually named after Jimmy Angel. It isn't named after angels. It's named after an explorer called Jimmy Angel, who in the first few decades of the 20th century was looking for gold. He flew over Angel Falls and spotted it from the air. Then a few years later, deliberately crash-landed his plane on Alyan Tepui to try and look for gold. Unfortunately, the plane went nose up and it couldn't take off again. So Jimmy Angel had already recce'd out a route in case of disaster. So he had to trek down from the summit of Angel Falls and escape, which he eventually did do. And say the beautiful Angel Falls, it turns to mist once you get beneath the falls. It's not water by that point, it's just a blast of mist. So it's pretty amazing and pretty spectacular to see. Now, one of the very interesting discoveries made recently, underneath the tepuis, underneath these ancient rocks, there are some of the largest quartzite caves in the world. Some of them are immense, and many of these have been found literally within the last few years, as in well within the 21st century. One system is over 6 kilometers big, and it's so large that the explorers couldn't even get to the end of all the passages. It is immense. One of the systems that was discovered recently on Mount Roraima is called the Cave of Crystal Eyes, because there are holes in the rock where eddies in water flowing over it has carved holes using the quartz crystals, which is harder than the sandstone of the mountain. And it's carved down holes into the rock where quartz accumulates. So when you walk through it with a torch, it glows like eyes, hence the Cave of Crystal Eyes. And, well, can you spot anything unusual about this photo? Have a close look. What do you think it might be? This is a photo taken by a wonderful friend of mine called Charles Brewer-Carius. If you look closely at this photo, can you spot anything? Nope, it's not to do with the water. Look a bit closer. It's those. Can you guess what they are? Yup, they're helicopters. That's how big, how enormous this is called the Cave of the Phantasma, the Cave of Ghosts in English, the Cave of Phantasms in Spanish, La Cueva de la Fantasma. It's that big, isn't it spectacular? So it just goes to show some of these incredible discoveries. And this was only found a few years ago. So it shows that these incredible discoveries, we're only beginning to understand the features of the Lost Worlds, let alone the wildlife that occur on them. And inside some of these beautiful cave systems that often have pretty incredible formations inside of them, some very, very weird formations called biogeography have been found. And these are still not fully understood, but it's thought that they're very different. They are chemically different from stalactites and stalagmites. And it's believed that they might grow, possibly through a cyanobacteria or something like that. They might be an organic formation that grows over thousands of years. So these definitely need to be studied more and need to work out what exactly they are. So there's this extraordinary new dimension, this new level of exploration underneath the lost worlds, below their mysterious summits lost in the clouds. So I hope you enjoyed my overview of the Tepuis Mountains, or Tepuis Mountains of Venezuela, the so-called lost worlds. And I thoroughly hope you stay safe during lockdown, and I hope this talk has brought a little bit of colour to staying indoors, which we've all been doing now for a few weeks. So take care, everyone, and I hope you get a chance to visit the beautiful Lost World Mountains for yourself. So thank you very much for listening.